One very effective tool that we can use to assess whether a tax is going to be effective or not is to look at what we call the incidence of taxation. And what we mean by that is if we impose an indirect tax on a particular industry, how is that tax shared between the firm and the consumer? In other words, how much of the tax is passed on to the consumer in the form of higher prices. So we'll just go through what it is first of all, and then we'll look at how we can evaluate this using elasticity. So this diagram shows us what happens when we impose a tax. So we move from the original supply curve to S plus tax. Now the fact that we've got a kind of a rotating supply curve here indicates that this is an ad valorem tax. This is a tax as a percentage of the price. So as we move from S to S plus tax, the result of that being that we move from our previous equilibrium, which was here, to our new equilibrium, which is there, resulting in a higher price and a lower quantity of trade. So that's the impact of a tax. But what we need to think about here is how much of that tax is being paid by the firm and how much of it is being passed on to the consumer. Now, if we think about the amount of tax is going to be the vertical distance between the two supply curves. So what we're saying here is that the amount of tax is represented by the vertical distance between the supply curves here. That is the total amount of tax which is being imposed. So, and the government imposes the ad valorem tax at quantity Q1. The length of that pink arrow there represents the total value of the tax. Now, what's equally clear is that the size of this tax is bigger than the actual change in price. And what this tells us is that the firm is obviously choosing to absorb some of this tax itself rather than passing it on to the consumer. This increase in price over here is the bit that affects the consumer. So what we can see is that actually there's another area that we need to mark on here. So what we can see is that this overall rectangular area here is the total burden of the tax. So the amount of the tax, which is its vertical side, multiplied by the quantity of units traded, the horizontal. So that total area in here is the total amount of tax. And that we can divide down into two bits. This bit that's on top of the price here, so between the previous price and the new price, this is the tax that is paid by the consumer. So the tax paid by the consumer, the price of the product rises from P to P1, so that's the amount of tax paid by the consumer. The amount in this green shaded area underneath here, this is the tax paid by the firms. And the share of those is what we call the incidence of taxation. So that's how we draw it on a diagram. But where this becomes really powerful is when we think about how this changes depending on the elasticity of demand. So let's move on and have a look at that. So what we've got here are two diagrams. The diagram on the left shows us a situation where we are imposing a tax when we have an inelastic demand price. So the line demand curve is more vertically sloped like this. And on the right we have an elastic demand price. So we've got a demand line which is closer to the horizontal. Now the way I've drawn this or attempted to draw this is that the tax imposed is the same in both cases. So the movement to S plus tax is the same in both diagrams. So what we need to do now is think about how the impact of these things is different depending on whether we've got elastic or inelastic demand. So if we think about what we can see here, then let's have a look at, first of all, the impact of the tax paid by the consumer. Now here, we don't need to add on any extra lines because it's the difference between the previous price and the new price out to the new level of quantity. So this is the amount of tax paid by the consumer in the diagram on the left, and this is the amount of tax paid by the consumer in the diagram on the right. If we add on the other line that we need, which is coming off the previous supply line at that point, this then gives us the amount which is being paid by the firm in an inelastic market and by the firm in an elastic market. So just to be clear, in both cases, green represents the incidence of tax paid by the firm and blue represents that paid by the consumer. So let's just have a quick look and compare. Now obviously in the diagram on the left, the area above the price here, this blue area, is by far the larger. That's what we would expect. If the demand for this product is inelastic, the firms are likely to try and pass it on to consumers because they'll continue to buy it regardless. Whereas in the diagram on the right, where we've got a more elastic demand, what we're seeing here is that essentially firms are having to take a bigger hit. They don't pass on as much of the tax to the consumer, so the increase in prices is much smaller. And the reason for that is it would have too big an impact on the amount that they sold. So let's think about then how we could evaluate this in terms of the effectiveness of these policies. So let's shrink this down a little bit and move it to the top of the screen like that. So what does this mean then in terms of how effective these policies are? Well, if we're looking at the diagram on the left, inelastic demand to price, what happens? Well, we can see that most of the tax is paid by the consumer. Okay. We can see that the reduction in Q is fairly small, and we can see that the overall area of tax revenue, i.e. the size of the green bit and the blue bit added together, is quite large. If we compare that with the elastic, obviously it's the reverse. So here most tax is paid by the firm. We can see that the reduction in Q is large, and tax revenue is smaller. Now, it's not really possible to say just on the surface of all of that which one is more effective at dealing with the market failure, but certainly what we can say is that a tax will have more impact in terms of the quantity reduction if demand for the product is elastic. What we can also say, though, is that imposing a tax on a product with inelastic demand will generate large amounts of revenue for the government, which we could then say they could obviously go on to use to subsidise an alternative product or provide an advertising campaign or something like that. But using the incidence of tax is a really effective way to evaluate whether an indirect tax is going to have the desired effect in terms of correcting the market failure.